let's kind of dive into the panel discussion topics. And if any of you at the audience have anything to ask or comment, I know we already kind of have had a panel discussion earlier, impromptu, but let's keep that happening. Last year we had, of course, it was like on-site event, but we had such lively panel discussions that I literally had to take off the mic from some of the audience members because the panel discussion attendees didn't have actually time to speak. But I think that's great. So anybody who has any topics that you want to come take into the panel discussion, please put them into the chat and we'll see how to include you. Okay, but let's kind of start from a round of you can just shortly introduce yourself in case we have some participants in the audience who haven't been here all the time, but let's just start from the kind of warm-up question. So there are lawyers and there are cybersecurity specialists and privacy people and all kinds of software development people, like Vlad was telling us, like not all developers are made equal either or talking to each other always. So which of these are in charge of keeping regulated software compliant? So I know that Vlad wants to take this question first, and I'll give you others kind of thinking about your answers first. So Vlad, what do you say?
So what I can say from my personal experience, probably the developers are the first one that don't want to hear about regulations. And I don't know why is that. So probably the language, the expectations, they kind of mismatch what they want to hear. So in the end, you have somebody that is like some senior member of the staff that takes over these things, but in the end, I don't know, the compliance or this kind should be everyone's business, and I think that explaining to everyone in a familiar language should be a top priority of the management in principle. So in the medical field, this is like probably noticed. So probably they got burned in the past and they had to mention that there, that you need commitment, you need policy, you need clear guidelines on who is doing who or what. And that is probably a good starting point, so that you understand that some steps you need them because so you have the authority to do it, and they have to be done. And actually, if you look at some of these things, so of course, like people will comment and will nag in the beginning, but if the processes are done with good intentions and the benefits are clear, over time you see that everybody gets on board.
Yeah, I can kind of relate to that, because everybody has probably read their fair share of RFCs and all kinds of standards, and I don't know who has been in a standardization committee, but it is like tedious sometimes. So what about Jörn? Where is your stand on this? You are maybe more of the user of this software, so.
Yeah, I think it is also the user who needs to think about these questions. I mean, what I said this morning is when we try connect data to persons, to companies, and so on. I mean, it's really important that you understand how the things you are using are working and where they come from. So when you look on how law enforcement is doing that, I mean, they really want things proven. I mean, they want real evidence, evidence that can be used in court. And when you find some snippets by a pen testing tool which is more or less, let's say, misused for this purpose, and you find the snippets, and then you draw the wrong conclusion, and you bring people into miscredit, you start a shitstorm, or that starts based on these things that you publish there. I think that is something where people have to think about if they really want to use the sources and how they use them and what they do with the results. The point is, it's maybe interesting to use them. The question is, how do you, as a user, work with this product and with the things? And then finally, for the bigger solutions, the ones I mentioned today, I ask one of these providers and say, okay, what can I tell my clients that are interested about this data flow where you can see who is searching what? How can we, let's say, tunnel that, like putting a VPN around it? Well, no answer. Yeah? So that means I know the answer.
Yeah, I think you're raising an absolutely important point, because if there are no users demanding or no customers demanding that your software is kind of approved and regulated, then in a lot of industries, it's not going to happen, or at least it's going to make it much more urgent for the vendor to do so. But then we have these vendors or these people who are working on these products that need to be compliant. So what about Cristian? How do you see this? Whose job it is to keep regulated software compliant?
So I'm drawing inspiration from financial regulations. In particular, the US has made quite a lot of progress on this issue. Not because they're very good at it, but because there were a lot of scandals that kind of required the area to be cleaned up. And what basically they say is that, well, you really need to have a tone at the top. So the board of the company is binding itself to a code of conduct. And then you need to really have that triple down and make each and every single employee responsible for compliance. Now, unfortunately, what I've seen when it comes to information security is that either there is a special information security department that kind of puts handcuffs on all of the developers, and then it really feels like, okay, they're pulling the handbrake in order to not allow developers to drive too fast, instead of explaining developers why it's important for them to keep the speed limits. And of course, there is a lot of tension and there is a lot of lack of motivation. Developers cannot really influence or find more efficient way of implementing compliance. And then, of course, it really feels like developers are pretty much stuck between the information security department that slows them down and the product manager that puts pressure on them to deliver features faster. Now, fortunately, I have also worked with one of the customers where this idea of compliance was pretty clear. It was delivered as a feature. So the board asked for this feature. Product managers were explained why this is a necessary feature. You don't go, I don't know, you don't open a bank in Norway before complying with Norwegian laws. It's just you can send as many leaflets as possible. You can spend as much budget on Google ads as you want to. You just don't do that. And then you could see that also developers were a little bit at ease, because suddenly they weren't. Security wasn't just an overhead, right? It wasn't like, oh, don't document this thing because the feature is already out there. No. Documenting these things and having standard operating procedures and having policy as code, that was seen as a core feature. And then you could also see that there was a bit more relaxed atmosphere around compliance in the whole organization. So in other ideas, I really think that it's from top to bottom and everybody's responsible for compliance, pretty much as with, when it comes to financial compliance, we're all responsible for making sure that we're spending travel expenses and we're declaring travel expenses as we should, and that the financial officer is sending the reports according to the board.
Yeah, it's actually the funny thing about Norwegian invoices and developers. I had to once explain, we had to comply with the Norwegian invoicing standards and calculate the Norwegian and Danish invoicing reference numbers in a specific way. And I had to then explain to the developers what is an invoice reference number before we go to the kind of whole show regulations. But, hey, so what about Mike Long? How are you seeing this? Is everything already said, or?
I mean, I'd say that there's two things I'd like to add. Like, one is that there's a famous quote from Richard Branson. He says, you don't learn to walk by following the rules. You learn to walk by falling over and trying again, something like this. And, everybody has this idea that this is the way you should innovate. That's great. if there's no consequences to you falling over, if you get a little bruise, that's no big deal for a kid. But the thing is, if you're dealing with financial transactions or MRI scanners or braking systems in cars, the consequences are a little bit different. So you can't just innovate as if you didn't have consequences. That doesn't make sense. And the other thing that I think that's kind of relevant as well is this idea of ownership, in a sense. Like, developers love to code, right? And some have this kind of mentality that the domain is just an implementation detail. I'm in my code. I love writing my code. I'll write my code. You know, I don't really care that much about, you know, banking transactions or anti-money laundering or specific branch requirements for if statements and MISRA C, for example. It can be different things, but in the end, that's the domain, and that's what they're paid to do. We're trying to solve technology problems in a domain. Without the domain, the code could be hello world. It has no value, no meaning, and it wouldn't pay our salaries. So we just can't ignore that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, like, I've been a product manager and had to kind of had that plan. But on the other hand, I've had so many wonderful developers who have just, you know, really been the most paranoid and the most kind of regulation observing people in the world, and that's actually really, really great. But hey, we have Mitro's comment here, how to enable innovative fail-fast culture with regulated contexts. So, for instance, in banks, the most innovative service software developers easily forget to enforce AML and or other regulatory requirements, and these needs are very different from the innovative software developers' mindset. We kind of answered already that in a way, but has anybody found any ways of like how to really do this, how to make it happen, like how to make that change? And anybody in the audience, if you want to pick in, please do so. Is it just, yes, we have to do it.
I could say something really quick just to get the balls rolling. One of the things that I've seen commonly running these days in banks, especially now, is the idea of a platform team. So there's this kind of, and like, there's always the tension, like there's elements of the bank that want to go out and innovate, and they'll go off somewhere outside of the typical domain of the IT infrastructure to do something, and then they have to try and pull them back into like some kind of compliant infrastructure. So a few years ago, it was the cloud, right? Some part of the bank would try and implement some kind of loan calculator application really quick, and they would use cloud services because they wanted to show that they could do it there. And you know, they would be able to deliver a prototype really quick, and then they had to go and engineer all the security and compliance on those on those. So this idea that like having somebody kind of making sure that you're following the rules is like an important tension that you need. Even if you give teams a little bit of rope to go out and innovate, you need to bring them back in and make sure that, you know, before they actually deal with transactions, before they actually go live, that, you know, they've got the GDPR, they've got the AML, they've got everything they need.
So
I think it's okay.
Room for innovation and then kind of reel in. So what about Vlad? Do you have any experience of this? How to make it happen in a good manner?
Yeah, I think that so so whenever we talk about this, like changing things, there is always probably a place in the organization who is maybe more receptive or ready to take on some of these aspects. And I think that that would be a good way to start. So run some experiments with a supporting team, show success, show the improvements, and show that it makes life easier for others. And from there, you just expand it. So I think that in general, this is not a DevOps like specific problem. So any kind of change, like moving from a monolith to microservice, for example, or from on-premise to the cloud is kind of similar. So if you see, or if you need to identify this kind of friends that will work with you, and that will, I think that will make things nice. And then there are all kind of tricks, like you have these pipeline radiators, yeah, with all kind of bells and whistles, yeah. So you have something nice, you add there, your radiator is green, then everybody likes it, yeah. So that.
Yeah, so give them carrots is the
Yeah.
No, I mean, like, yeah, I mean, obviously it needs to be a little bit fun for to survive that kind of a little bit more tedious thing, but as long as everybody understands the meaning is pretty much what you guys are saying. So any other quick comments on this question from Cristian or?
I just wanted to add a bit on what Mike said. So I totally agree with him that this tension between, let's say, the core compliance platform team and the more innovative centers of the organization are very positive, right? Because that's how you find the right balance between innovation speed while still staying within the boundaries of compliance. And I think that cloud technologies offer also an opportunity to, first of all, create a safer environment, or a more relaxed but equally safe, more like staging or development environment where ideas can be tried out without immediately having to worry about compliance aspect. But I can also see that cloud technologies enable to reduce the compliance burden. So I know, for example, you're coding something really quickly and suddenly you have to ask yourself, okay, what's your business continuity plan? How do you do backups? How do you deal with redundancy? Is this running in multiple data centers? Do you have proper in-transit and at-rest encryption? And what I noticed is that often some of these questions are as easy to answer with cloud technology as just flipping a switch, like, yep, enable in-transit decryption, done. Next compliance aspect. So I'm really hoping that as the technology will mature, maybe that will imply a few more fines, maybe that will imply that the whole industry takes information security a bit more seriously, then this compliance aspect will also get a little bit more boring, and where we'll hopefully reach this Zen moment where we'll have found a way to move fast while at the same time staying with the guard list of compliance.
Yeah, actually, Mitra is suggesting here in the comments about like using more developer-friendly APIs for regulatory purposes, and I'm actually giving this to Jörn now because Jörn, you're a friend of APIs, as I've come to learn. Yeah, APIs are common love, but the idea of like if you could see as a customer, or if you would put your kind of more of a legal hat on. And I know we have actually lawyers in the audience too. So if you would be able to see using APIs, what's the kind of compliance status, for example, of the platform or software you are using, how do you see that as a possibility?
Yeah, I think that is definitely an area where you then have the chance to regulate something and to control it. So, I mean, the API itself describes the possibility. And when I remember when I did my first investigations in eBay, everything was possible there. Yeah, everything very easy to link an email address to the existing account and all this kind of stuff. Then they were scraped. And everybody could do things with eBay data. And then they stopped the scraping and put everything into an API. And from that day on, it was more clear what you get. And you have not the question if you violate terms and conditions by scraping. But now you purchase the data, and then you know what you can do with it. And it was within this API. So the point in my industry, I think that is not that people do not like really, is if you say, well, this data is not provided, so we cannot access it. I mean, sometimes I have the feeling people don't understand the sense of no. Yeah, I mean, sometimes difficult to understand these two characters. So they still want the things, and they want scraped data put into a database and then a nice API to access it. So, but definitely I think an API is easier to control and describes more the possibility made by the API provider and the source, and that opens more transparency.
Yeah, actually, and that's kind of really understandable when you're talking about kind of data compliance, and there are all these kind of fraud prevention APIs for payments and for e-commerce especially, which is kind of like Mito is pointing out there, regulation as a service. But Cristian, would you like to comment on this? You commented already in there in the chat, but.
No, I totally agree with what has been said before. So on one hand, the APIs bring a challenge because they essentially become, in GDPR terms, data sub-processors. So you need to make your due diligence and sign a proper data processing agreement. And, you know, they actually have to stick to regulations. You cannot just throw the problem on the other side of the fence. However, if you have good API providers, then they can effectively reduce your compliance burden. And I think you highlighted it very nicely. So for example, a payment processor, they can significantly reduce your burden to deal with PCI DSS. Or I had also customers that were focusing on front-facing, let's say, banking, and were using a different platform for core banking. So they didn't have to integrate directly with the central bank or, you know, implement a lot of those regulations. So again, those platforms were helping them reduce the compliance burden and quickly spin up a bank. And yeah, I think the next decade will probably show us more of these APIs that can really reduce our compliance burden and make it a bit easier to just tinker things together, do a bit of due diligence, and make sure that you can focus only on your core compliance, so to speak, without having to deal with, oh, how do I do analytics in a GDPR compliant way, or how do you do backups in a GDPR compliant way, and so on.
But I'm sure that some of the people in the audience would argue that, oh yes, this is all fine when we talk about, you know, cloud and SaaS and you know, all that fancy new stuff. And then there's the kind of devices and high security and other applications. But Vlad, you had something to say about this topic too.
Yeah, so obviously there are some technology areas which are, let's say, more ready for automation. But that's like, I think that if we look back from where we started, there was a point when there were no clouds and everything was done manually, everything was any kind of, so everybody has their own scripts that you need to learn a couple of days how to run something simpler. So I remember the days when, so I was working at Nokia when you, to install the Symbian toolchain, it was an adventure. I think that not everyone was reaching the end. So there were casualties on the road. Yeah, but I think that we just need to see or to find a balance between your own like specialized environment and optimizing for that versus using something that has some aspect like genericity, and yeah, well, it has some parts that are not useful for you, but you start to build on top of that. And this is like the open source kind of approach that, yeah, like it starts small and then kind of explodes somewhere that you haven't anticipated. So if you look at yeah, so the tool chains are, so some tool chains are not that easy to automate, but I think that we see a lot of developments like how to flash devices. So going from GUI tools to CLIs and so on. So they have different audience. So if we talk about coding to configuration and then to low code and things like this, so they are all sides of automation in the end.
And in the end, somebody who is not a coder needs to be able to also understand if the result is compliant or not, which is of course an interesting part of all these tools. But actually, when we were preparing for this conference, I think it was Tessa who was going to talk in the afternoon, but she was kind of pointing out that what if the standards would actually be API 5? So for example, the ISO standards and everything else. So what if you could kind of more like basically what Mika was saying, but from a maybe slightly different point of view. But if you would be able to kind of check that, hey, I'm using this and this and this stuff, and I need to be compliant to this standard, then you could just, throw in the tape and say, okay, these words, I have no idea how the heck that would work, but maybe some of you have. So maybe if somebody wants to comment on this.
I could start with a small reaction on that. So I kind of like the aspect that Vlad brings. We'll never be done with compliance, but rather what open source and cloud technologies will hopefully enable you is to get away with the boring compliance questions and really deal with those compliance questions that are related to your innovation. And it's a little bit the thing that you were mentioned, like, okay, just I also noticed that there is an aspect called risk appetite, and also, you need to constantly evaluate your risk. So, for example, I'm not very good at medical device regulation, but I would assume that, if you have some disease that is anyway kind of terminal, then probably people have a higher risk appetite for trying new things out. Whereas if it's some kind of vaccine that, this is just an uncomfort to life, but people can live with this disease anyway, then probably the risk appetite is very small. And then you might want to, it deserves a different approach to risk. And I think API will never completely externalize compliance. Like I said, it would just probably get this boring aspect of compliance out. Like basically you will have to say, okay, what's your risk appetite from 0 to 10? Okay, then you need a lot of redundancy, very current backups, run the long test suite, not just the short suite test suite on each PR, and so on. And I think that's the way things will be moving.
And Mika is writing there that the ISO is going to change standards writing so that each regulatory clause can be individually referred. So then some sort of automation might be possible, at least for the reporting part, and at least kind of connecting it for your test. I think that, okay, these are now the parts that we have covered with these tests and so forth. So that would be interesting. Any other comments? Yes, Mike.
I just want to add something that I see over and over again over the last years is that in finance especially is that the regulations are very vague. It just says you should have change management, and that could mean anything, really absolutely anything. So every single organization has to reinvent the wheel, figuring out what that means, how they should manage controls, how they should think about controls. And because they're all in competition with each other, they don't really talk to each other about how they approach this and what the regulators are, they're kind of coming in from outside, trying to be the antagonist in this picture, trying to pull at the strings as auditors. So there's not a really rich knowledge sharing community around this so far. And I think that that's something, obviously conferences like this can help with, but I think that building the community around this is really important.
And I think that this is kind of exactly the reason why we started out this, because if you take, I have a question to you coming up. I'm kind of giving you a full warning. I'm going to ask you about kind of regulation and RegOps outside of medical. Like, what are the industries that can be affected? But while you're thinking about that, and if audience has any more comments, I just want to say that laws, we've talked about standards, but then when we go to laws and we try to make the companies and the software and the devices compliant to specific laws. So one of the interesting laws that I had to deal with was around travel. So basically traffic and travel operators, like everything from taxis to airplanes, and they had to actually, according to this law, open their APIs and give open data, and the open APIs were basically, according to law, they had very, very specific requirements, but then again, they were also very, very broad, and basically anything could pass for an API according to that law, as long as they just open it up and provide it to everybody else. And of course, that they did some kind of certification and something like that. So if you think about writing laws, if you think about kind of trying to implement those laws, PSD, GDPR, of course, being one of them. So, and every industry has their own laws that you need to understand. So how does that work from the lawmaker to the lawyer to the kind of compliance person, product manager, developer? That is a very interesting thing, but how do you see this as kind of regulations versus different industries? Is every industry a regulated industry? Should they all mind RegOps? Who wants to go first? Well, you already started.
I'm not sure, but I can say that I work with a couple of customers here in Norway that are building systems based on PSD2, open banking. And they, one of the interesting things is that all the banks say that they've done open banking and they've all got APIs, and nearly none of them work. They've got poor documentation, they've got unspecified and undefined behavior. Trying to build a business on these APIs that have been forced by regulation is very poor. And I know one company that's created automated tests against major banks, and then as these tests fail, they report them in real time to the Financial Services Authority, which I think is quite an interesting aspect of the marketplace right now. But it's hard for, unless there's a stick to go along with the regulation, it's hard for it to actually land. I think that this is because like PSD2 is the one I know the most, because it's just coming out. The banks have rushed to implement something, and now that third parties are starting to use these APIs, you're starting to see all the challenges faced there and the weaknesses.
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, like there's huge responsibility actually for the lawyers and for the standard makers to actually understand how the heck everything should work. And then to give in the instructions or not to give instructions to how to implement that. But hey, any other comments on this?
Yes. Yeah. So we need to look at the timeline on which change happened on these different. So if we are talking about legislation, that doesn't change too often. So in the medical field, if you look in US, HIPAA is from the mid-90s. So internet at that time was like used in academia, maybe some few people outside, but that was all. And they have to stand the test, the test of time. Yeah, like, and they reflect like what was the understanding or what society expected at that time. And then you have these technical standards like ISO, which are adopted by consensus of governments. And again, like, is something that is very difficult to change. It's a lengthy process and kind of expensive. And then the technology evolves at such a fast pace, and the pace is accelerating. So, and we have to look at, like, everybody has some constraints, boundary, like throughput, yeah, like how much you can process and how much competence you have in this and so on. So I don't know, if you look at in this medical field, it's kind of amazing that we managed to work under this old kind of legislation, and it was adopted, and FDA and EU equivalents, in the regulators in the every country, they worked proactively, and I think that they done a good job.
Yeah, right. Job, but there was enough regulators and enough,
Well, one thing that is interesting about ISO standards is that they require results and they don't prescribe like recipes. And that is a good way to handle it. So they give freedom to implementers to innovate.
And I think that's really important, because sometimes you have these laws which say like you have to do things like this, but then when you ask why has this law been written in the first place, nobody really has the answer, and that is very confusing. But hey, Jörn, do you have like a point for this? So you're kind of more into the enforcing the law.
No, actually, I mean, our whole area is very unregulated. Yeah. So, I mean, in some countries, you have more license for the people who conduct this work. In other areas, like in Germany, it's less licensed. So I think I cannot really contribute here to this idea.
You're basically looking at things like, are others abiding to the regulations of like other industries, and that's an interesting kind of thing, and also the kind of difference between different countries in terms of these regulations, because I think that's an important thing that was coming up already in the first talks, that yes, there are these very international standards, and then there are some more international laws, but when you go to the law side of things, then it's kind of coming down to each and every area and each and every country having these different laws. So that's, I think, a big difference between standards and laws. But did you have, Cristian, something to this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a bit on Mike's and on everything that has been said before. So I think one of the challenges is also that the regulatory landscape is quite fast evolving, and also the technological landscape is fast evolving. So if I'm thinking about PSD2 or about GDPR, they have been around for just a few years. So it takes, like Vlad mentioned, a lot of time to build the necessary competence, the necessary DNA across all professionals in industry to kind of figure out that, this is something we have to live with. It's not something that is annoying us, just as nobody's complaining that you have to wait at the red light anymore. But I assume that people were very much complaining about this, and they didn't really notice the red lights to begin with.
There's a lot of differences in different countries about complaining about.
Exactly, and there are also cultural differences about how you treat red lights, right? But at least in the Nordics nowadays, stopping at red lights is just part of the DNA of everybody. You learn it as a child. The discussion moved on, and I think this is also the problem with the regulatory landscape. It takes some time until you form these habits and this DNA. And then a bit like Vlad just mentioned, like some of these laws and regulations, they are, let's say, ambiguous on purpose, because they really need to be as technologically independent as possible. And I very much liked how he brought the HIPAA example, because it's quite an amazing piece of legislation. I mean, it's basically like the skinnier version of GDPR, in my opinion. So it only covers medical data, whereas GDPR covers all personal data. And it actually passed the test of time. On the other hand, it did put a lot of burden on the industry to figure out, okay, so you want to maintain privacy and security. How do you do that as the technology evolves? Like, okay, so you have, for example, handheld devices that are recording your heartbeat. Well, does that count as medical data or not? And the legislator didn't quite, it's not their goal to answer this kind of question. It's up to everybody to answer it. What often happens is that courts also give opinions, or in worst case, they just sue you for not having done your due diligence and actually evaluating what is and what is not part of that regulation. And let's say that there are also this secondary law, right? So the European Court of Justice comes quite often with opinions on how GDPR should be applied to certain things. So, for example, it's not, you shouldn't have in European law that cookies or local storage or IP addresses are personal data, right? That's something that rather the industry standard or maybe some court ruling should decide. And I think this is really the challenge, that, okay, the law is not really the end goal, is just setting a direction and a target and an ideal, but then how exactly it applies to everybody's work is their own responsibility to judge and to decide this.
Yeah, I think that kind of is exactly how we just need to deal with it and learn to deal with it, basically, and also from what Jörn was talking about earlier. I think that it's also important that the regulations and regulators are kind of giving you how everything should ideally work, but then there's the kind of darker side to things that you need to also think about, that how things really work and how people can misuse things and so forth. But Laura has a really, really important point there in the chat, that I think that everybody was saying that yes, it's everybody's kind of business to mind the regulatory compliance stuff in the software development, but on the other hand, yes, of course, somebody else needs to be responsible than the developer, and that brings us to the last point of the panel. So what do you think needs to be, like, what skills are basically needed for, let's say, a product manager or IT manager or business manager or lawyer or somebody who is like the compliance responsible there in the company? What do they need to understand about software and compliance from a software level to be that responsible person, and not to just shove it to the developers' backs and, hey, you guys develop this software, you need to make sure it's compliant? Anybody want to take this topic?
I think you need somebody who is asking the right questions. I was just thinking, oh, I could do such job. I don't think I really could, but in theory, I mean, at the end, you need to follow this process and this change. I mean, it's a complex world. Software development is, I have a high respect for people who are able to do that. I still want to learn Python. One day I do that really, so I can use these things. But I have a deep respect. But you need to be this position. And where it sits, is it in the security department in Y world? Is it compliance? Is it legal, cybersecurity, IT? I mean, that's probably different per company, how the setup is. But I think that this is an important role. And then you need to ask the question, okay, what is the process and what is touched? And it's like a cross-functional thing. You need to talk to IT, you need to talk to the privacy officer to talk about, okay, do we submit data to other countries, and this kind of thing. So I think it starts in the beginning. It starts with what I always do, asking questions.
So a multi-talented person who is good at asking questions. Good. Any other points to this? Mike looks like he wants to say something. Oh, Vlad?
Yeah, I can say, I mean, I always want to say something, so that's part of the problem. I think that it's really, I like this start with why framework from Simon Sinek. Like, very often, I think a lot gets lost in translation from the requirements on the business to the way people actually work. And I think that instead of telling people what to do, it's much more effective if you say why they have to do it. That what risks are being controlled, what is the purpose of any of this? We follow this standard because we're regulated against this law, or because we want to meet this ISO standard so that our product can be sold in America, which will, in the end, make sure that we have enough income to be able to pay our salaries. There's always a why, and we need to get to it. And we need to make sure that it's not just, here's a rule for you to follow, but there's an actual connection for everybody to follow the rules.
I think that is very important, and kind of our conclusion from this is that I've met really, really great developers who, when they got the idea of why is it important to kind of understand the laws and the regulations, they were actually kind of taking a knee-deep dive into them. And like I had this developer who came back from like 1 week of solitary coding because he had kind of dived into the annual holiday calculations of the world and the legal aspects of it. And he came back and he was like, I know now how to calculate everybody's Easter time. And I was like, okay. But I think that's kind of like one important aspect, that there is this kind of multidisciplinary, multi-talenting, and it's kind of like everybody's business, but then there's still somebody who takes the lead and is kind of willing to take the lead and is willing to kind of understand the lawyers in the team and understand the developers in the team and everybody else. And I totally agree with Jörn there and with you, Mike. And thank you for Laura to bringing up a really important point there. So I have now the privilege to say that thank you, panelists, for the awesome panel, and thank you for all the audience there.